I was 22 years old when my brother looked me in the eye, handed me a cardboard box, and told me I had 72 hours to leave the apartment we'd shared since college. No warning. No explanation. Just a box and a deadline. So I left. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I packed what I could carry, slept on a friend's couch for 3 months, and rebuilt my life from nothing, while my brother moved his girlfriend into my room before my pillow had even gone cold. I told myself it was fine. I told myself he was fine. I focused forward, worked harder than I ever had, and eventually stopped thinking about Derek altogether. Until 4 years later, when a number I'd long since deleted lit up my phone at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. "Hey, it's Derek. I know it's been a while. I really need to talk to you." My first instinct was to hang up. My second instinct was to listen, because something in his voice told me he was desperate. And Derek never got desperate. What he said next changed everything. He needed my help. And he needed it fast. What he didn't know was that I already knew exactly what he'd done. And I'd been quietly waiting for this call for a very long time. Let me take you back to where this story really starts. Growing up, Derek and I were close. The way siblings are when it's just the two of you and your parents are working double shifts to keep the lights on. Our mom, Carol, was a nurse. Our dad, Raymond, drove long-haul trucks. They were good people. Tired people. The kind of parents who loved you deeply but didn't always have the bandwidth to notice which child was carrying more than their share. Derek noticed that gap early. And he learned how to work it. He was 2 years older than me, charming in that effortless way that made teachers overlook his missing homework and neighbors loan him their lawnmowers without asking for them back. Derek could walk into any room, flash that easy smile, and within 10 minutes everyone in that room would be doing something for him. I was different. I was the one who stayed late at the library. The one who triple-checked her scholarship applications. The one who took a part-time job at 16, not because my parents asked me to, but because I'd done the math and understood even then that nobody was coming to save me. I had to build my own floor. And I did. By the time Derek and I ended up as roommates at 20, his idea, pitched to our parents as a cost-saving measure, a practical arrangement, I was already paying 70% of the rent. He was between opportunities, which was Derek's phrase for unemployed, and everyone in the family accepted it the way you accept weather. Just Derek being Derek. Mom would say it with a soft smile. He just needs time to find his footing. Dad would nod from behind his coffee mug. That boy's got potential. Just hasn't found his lane yet. I paid the electricity bill and said nothing. Here's what nobody talked about at Sunday dinners. Derek had potential in the same way a car with no engine has potential. It looks the part. It sits in the driveway. But it doesn't go anywhere unless someone else is pushing it. And for most of Derek's adult life, that someone was me. I covered his half of the rent 3 months in a row when he said his new job hadn't paid out yet. I lent him $800 for a car repair he swore he'd pay back before the end of the month. I bought groceries, cleaned the apartment, handled the lease renewal paperwork because Derek found admin tasks, his word, tedious. And every time our parents called, Derek would casually mention that we were doing great, that living together was working out really well, that I was such a good sister. He wasn't wrong. I was. That was the problem. What I didn't know, what I had absolutely no idea about, was that Derek had been having a different conversation with someone else entirely. Her name was Simone. 24, freshly relocated to our city, looking for a place to land. Derek had met her at a bar in March. By April, he'd decided she was moving in. The only obstacle was me. I found this out later, piece by piece, the way you find out most things that were deliberately hidden from you. A mutual friend let something slip. Then another. And then one evening I ran into a woman named Felicity, a friend of Simone's, at the coffee shop 2 blocks from our building. She assumed I already knew everything. She said it so casually, like old news. "Oh, Derek said you were totally fine with it. He said you were actually excited to find your own place." I remember setting down my cup very carefully. I remember making sure my voice was even when I asked her to tell me more. What Felicity described was a plan Derek had been running for weeks. He told Simone the apartment was essentially his, glossed right over my name on the lease, my deposit, my furniture, my life neatly arranged in every room. He told his friends I was planning to move out anyway, that I was ready for a change. He'd already shown Simone photos of the bedroom. Her bedroom. My bedroom. The eviction, and that is the right word for what he did, wasn't a decision he made in anger. It wasn't an argument that escalated. It was a calculated removal, executed with the same easy confidence Derek applied to everything. He simply decided the apartment was more useful to him without me in it, and so he handed me a cardboard box and gave me 72 hours to disappear. No conversation. No apology. No acknowledgement that half of everything in that apartment existed because of me. When I called our mother crying from my friend's couch, she listened quietly. Then she said, "Honey, Derek's at a real turning point with this girl. Sometimes you have to give people the space to grow." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Give people the space to grow. I had given Derek $800 I never got back, 3 months of covered rent, 2 years of wiped counters and handled paperwork and quiet sacrifices nobody bothered to name. And what he needed apparently was more space. So I gave it to him. I stopped calling. I stopped checking in. I redirected every ounce of energy I'd spent managing Derek's life into building my own. I finished my accounting certification. I landed a junior analyst role at a mid-size firm downtown. I found a studio apartment I could afford alone, decorated it with furniture I picked out myself, and woke up every morning in a space that had only my name attached to it. 4 years passed. Derek moved forward too, or so I assumed. He had Simone, the apartment, the life he'd quietly engineered at my expense. And then at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, his number appeared on my screen. And the voice on the other end of that call wasn't the smooth, easy Derek I'd grown up with. It was something I'd never heard from my brother before. It was panic. I let the phone ring 4 times before I answered. Not because I was playing games. Because I needed 4 seconds to decide what version of myself was going to pick up. The version that still remembered crying on a friend's couch. Or the version I'd spent 4 years becoming. I picked up. "Hey." His voice was careful. Measured. The way Derek talked when he wanted something and knew he had to be strategic about asking for it. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." I didn't tell him I almost didn't. I just said, "What's going on, Derek?" There was a pause. A long one. And in that pause I heard something I'd genuinely never heard from my brother in 26 years of knowing him. He sounded small. "I'm in some trouble," he said. "Financial trouble. Pretty serious." I waited. "I need your help. I know I don't have any right to ask. I know that. But I didn't know who else to call." And there it was. The sentence that was supposed to unlock something in me. The admission of wrongdoing bundled so neatly with the ask that you almost missed where one ended and the other began. Derek had always been good at that. Folding the apology into the request so you couldn't accept one without granting the other. I told him to explain. What came out over the next 20 minutes was a story delivered in fragments, pieces offered carefully, like a man feeding bread to a bird he wasn't sure would stay. Derek and Simone had broken up 18 months ago. The apartment, my old apartment, the one he'd handed me a cardboard box to vacate, was gone. He'd lost the lease when Simone left because, as it turned out after I'd moved out, Derek had eventually added Simone to the lease and removed himself to help her qualify for a lower insurance rate. A decision that made sense to nobody except Derek, which should tell you everything. When Simone left, she kept the apartment. Derek had no legal standing to fight it. He'd been renting a room in a shared house for the past year. Working inconsistently. And now he said he had a debt situation. A significant one. A private loan he'd taken out 2 years ago from a man named Gerald Tate. A friend of a friend, the kind of arrangement that sounds manageable until it catastrophically isn't. The loan was $40,000. The agreed repayment terms had been casual, verbal, the way Derek handled everything important in his life. And now Gerald Tate wanted his money back. with interest that had compounded in ways Derek either hadn't understood or hadn't wanted to understand when he signed the paperwork. The total owed was $61,000. Derek didn't have $61,000. Derek didn't have $6,000. Derek, at 30 years old, had approximately $400 in a checking account and a collection of excuses he'd been recycling since his early 20s. "I just need a bridge," he said. "Just enough to stop Gerald from taking this to court. Once he backs off, I can restructure and figure out a real payment plan. I just need someone to help me buy time." I let the silence sit for a moment. "What exactly are you asking me for, Derek?" Another pause. "I was hoping you could lend me some money. Or co-sign something. Or just talk to Gerald with me. He's more reasonable in person. I think if he met you, if he understood that I had family support, he'd back off on the timeline. I want you to notice something about that ask. Because I noticed it in real time sitting in my apartment for years of distance between me and that cardboard box, listening to my brother describe a crisis entirely of his own making. He didn't ask me for forgiveness. He didn't acknowledge what he'd done. He jumped straight from 'I'm in trouble' to 'will you fix it,' without pausing even briefly in the space where accountability lives. I asked him one question. 'Derek, do you know why I haven't spoken to you in 4 years?' Silence. 'It's because of the apartment,' I said. 'You handed me a box in 72 hours and you never once called to check if I was okay. You told people I was excited to move out. You told Simone the apartment was yours. You erased me from my own life and acted like it was a scheduling change.' He exhaled. 'I know. I handled that badly. You handled it badly.' I repeated it exactly the way he said it. Flat. No inflection. I wanted him to hear how it sounded. I was young. I was stupid about Simone. I thought, I don't know what I thought. That you'd land on your feet. That you always do. And there it was. The thing families say to the person they've decided is strong enough to absorb damage without complaint. You always land on your feet. Sounds like a compliment. It functions like permission. Permission to keep knocking you down because you'll get back up anyway, so what's the harm? I told him I needed to think about it and I'd call him back. I didn't call him back that night. I made a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. Not to research anything in particular. Just to organize my thoughts the way I always did. By writing things down, making lists, looking at information clearly instead of emotionally. I typed Gerald Tate's name into a search engine. This is where the story changes. Because Gerald Tate wasn't just some acquaintance with cash to spare. Gerald Tate was a private lender with a very specific and very well-documented pattern of behavior. He'd been the subject of a complaint filed with the state attorney general's office 2 years prior. The complaint alleged predatory lending practices, specifically, targeting borrowers in financially vulnerable positions, using vague verbal agreements to obscure compounding interest terms, and then threatening legal action with enough aggression to force settlements before borrowers could seek proper counsel. He hadn't been charged with anything. But the complaint was public record. And reading it, I felt something shift in my chest. Not sympathy for Derek exactly. More like the particular discomfort of realizing that your frustrating, irresponsible brother might have walked into something genuinely predatory and not entirely understood what he was stepping into. I called my colleague Priya the next morning. We'd worked together for 3 years by that point. She handled contract reviews at the firm and had a sharper eye for financial documentation than anyone I knew. I described the situation in broad strokes, no names, just the shape of it. Private loan, verbal terms, compounding interest, aggressive collection pressure. Priya didn't hesitate. He needs to see the actual loan documents, she said. If the terms were verbal and the paperwork is vague, there may be grounds to challenge the interest calculation. What did he sign? I didn't know. Derek hadn't mentioned specific paperwork. Which was either because he didn't think it mattered or because he hadn't read it carefully when he signed. Knowing Derek, it was both. I called him back that afternoon. I need you to send me everything you signed, I said. Every document. Scan it, photograph it, whatever. I need to see the actual paperwork before I can have any conversation about helping you. Pause. Why? Because I'm an accountant, Derek. I'm not going to walk into a meeting with a private lender without understanding the numbers first. It's pretty straightforward. If it were straightforward, you wouldn't owe $61,000 on a $40,000 loan in 2 years. Silence. Then quietly fair. The documents arrived in my email 3 hours later. 4 pages. And I want to be clear, I am not a lawyer. But I work with contracts and financial documents every single day of my professional life. And what I saw in those 4 pages made me sit back in my chair and take a very slow breath. The interest rate wasn't stated as an annual percentage the way regulated lenders are required to disclose it. It was described as a monthly service fee of 4%, which sounds manageable until you run the math. 4% monthly compounds to roughly 60% annually. On a $40,000 principal over 24 months, that number doesn't just grow, it metastasizes. The repayment timeline was listed as flexible, to be determined by mutual agreement, which meant Gerald Tate could decide at any moment that the timeline had expired. There was no fixed end date. There was no cap on the service fee accumulation. There was a clause buried in the 3rd page in noticeably smaller font that stated any legal dispute would result in the borrower being responsible for all attorney fees regardless of outcome. It was a trap. An elegant, quietly constructed trap for someone who needed money fast and didn't read carefully. I forwarded everything to Priya. Her response came back in 40 minutes. This is predatory. The interest disclosure alone potentially violates state lending regulations. He should not pay this without legal counsel. Do not co-sign anything. Do not hand over money directly. Get him a consumer protection attorney first. I read her message twice. Then I sat with something uncomfortable for a long moment. Because here is the truth that I had to reckon with honestly before I decided how to proceed. Derek had done something genuinely harmful to me. He had evicted me from my own life without a second thought and spent 4 years not calling. He was irresponsible in ways that were deeply, structurally his own fault. The debt he was in existed because of choices he made voluntarily, repeatedly, over a long period of time. And also, the person trying to collect that debt may have been exploiting him. Both of those things were true simultaneously. And I had to decide what I was going to do with that. I called Derek that evening. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he'd been staring at his phone all day. I looked at your documents, I said. And Gerald Tate may be in violation of state lending regulations. The interest disclosure is not compliant with how private loans are required to be structured. You may have grounds to challenge the amount he's claiming you owe. Dead silence. What does that mean? It means you need a consumer protection attorney before you pay a single dollar or agree to a single thing. It means do not respond to Gerald Tate's calls without counsel present. And it means, I paused, that I'm not going to co-sign anything or hand you money to give to this man, because doing that would be throwing resources into something that may not even be legally enforceable the way he's presenting it. Derek's voice went tight. So you're not going to help me. I'm helping you right now. I spent last night and this morning reviewing your documents and identifying a potential legal defense. That's help. I need money, not a legal opinion. Derek kept my voice even. If you hand Gerald Tate money right now without understanding what you actually owe under the law, you may be paying a number that was illegally calculated. You could pay him $30,000 and he could come back for more because nothing about the repayment structure is clearly defined. He said if I don't come to the table by the end of the month, he's suing. Then you need an attorney before the end of the month. A long pause. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the old frustration gathering in him, the familiar resistance to being told something he didn't want to hear from someone he'd always been able to manage. You know what, he said, I thought you might actually step up this time. But you're still doing the same thing you always did. Hiding behind logic instead of just being a sister. I want to tell you that sentence didn't land. But it did. Not because it was true, it wasn't true. but because it was delivered with the specific precision Derek had always had for finding the sentence most likely to make me doubt myself. Hiding behind logic. As though thinking carefully before acting was a character flaw. As though being responsible was the same as being cold. I recognized it. That's the important part. I recognized it the way you recognize a magician's trick once someone's shown you how it works. The accusation was designed to make me feel that being measured and careful was a form of cruelty, so that acting impulsively in his favor would feel like warmth. I didn't take the bait. I'm going to send you the name and number of a consumer protection attorney, I said. She does free initial consultations. Call her before you do anything else. That's what being a sister looks like right now, whether it feels like it to you or not. I texted him the contact information. He didn't respond. I put my phone down, went to my kitchen and made dinner. Stood at the stove stirring pasta, looking out the window at the street below, thinking about the 4 years I'd spent becoming someone who didn't fold under pressure. Derek called me back 2 hours later. And this time the careful, managed voice was completely gone. I went through my emails, he said. I found something. Something I think you need to know about. Something Gerald has been doing. He wasn't panicked anymore. He was something else. Something quieter and more frightened. It's not just me, he said. He's done this to other people. I found 3 names. People from the same building I used to live in. Same loan structure, same timeline, same pressure tactics. I set down my fork. Derek, forward me everything you found. I already did. I opened my laptop. And what I found in that email changed everything about what happened next. The email Derek forwarded contained 4 attachments. I opened the first one. It was a screenshot of a private Facebook group. A closed group with 47 members titled simply G Tate Borrowers. The description at the top read, "For anyone who has dealt with Gerald Tate and needs a safe place to compare notes. No judgment. No names shared outside this group." I scrolled through the posts. The earliest one was dated 14 months ago. A woman named Denise, no last name visible, had written a long, careful post describing a loan she'd taken from Gerald Tate after losing her job. $15,000. She'd needed it to cover 3 months of rent while she got back on her feet. The terms had been presented to her verbally as low-interest, flexible repayment. She'd signed a document she described as 2 pages, handwritten in parts, with a notary stamp she later discovered belonged to a notary who had no record of witnessing the signing. Within 18 months, Gerald Tate was claiming she owed $34,000. The replies beneath her post were immediate. 12 people responded within the first hour. Every single one of them had a version of the same story. Different amounts, different circumstances, same structure. A loan presented casually, paperwork that obscured the true cost, a repayment timeline that didn't exist until Gerald Tate decided it did, and then aggressive collection pressure timed specifically to arrive when the borrower was least equipped to push back. I opened the second attachment. It was a formal complaint document. Not the one I'd found in the Attorney General's public records. This was a second complaint, filed 8 months after the first, by a coalition of 6 borrowers who had pooled their documentation with the help of a paralegal volunteer from a local legal aid organization. The complaint was detailed, methodical, 43 pages including supporting exhibits. It named specific loan agreements, specific interest calculations, specific instances where Gerald Tate had misrepresented his credentials as a licensed lender. He wasn't licensed. That was the detail that stopped me cold. Gerald Tate was not a licensed private lender in our state. He had never applied for licensure. He operated entirely in the informal economy of personal loans and handshake agreements, which meant he existed in a legal gray area, but one with very specific boundaries. Unlicensed lenders in our state are prohibited from charging interest above a certain rate and are not permitted to pursue legal action to collect on loans that don't meet regulatory disclosure requirements. If Gerald Tate sued Derek, he would have to walk into a courtroom and explain why his loan agreement looked the way it did. And based on what I was reading, that was a courtroom appearance he would not survive. The third attachment was a spreadsheet. Someone in the Facebook group, a woman named Rosalind, whose name appeared repeatedly in the thread as a kind of informal organizer, had compiled a master document of every loan she'd been able to confirm. 17 entries. Names anonymized to initials, but loan amounts, dates, original principals, and claimed balances all laid out in clean columns. The average loan was $22,000. The average claimed repayment amount was $48,000. The average time elapsed was 20 months. The math was not complicated. Gerald Tate had extracted, by Rosalind's conservative estimate, somewhere in the range of $430,000 from 17 people over a 3-year period. And that was only the borrowers who had found the group. The actual number was almost certainly higher. I opened the fourth attachment last. It was a personal message Derek had received through Facebook from Rosalind directly. She had tracked him down through a mutual connection, someone from his old building who was also in the group. The message was 3 paragraphs. She explained who she was, described the group, and asked Derek to reach out if he wanted to add his documentation to the coalition's file. She said, and I read this sentence twice, "We are currently working with a consumer protection attorney who believes we have sufficient evidence to support both a civil claim and a referral to the state financial crimes unit. We need more borrowers willing to come forward. Numbers matter." She had sent that message to Derek 6 weeks ago. Derek had not responded to it. I called him immediately. "Did you read this?" I asked. "All of it?" "I read some of it." His voice was defensive in the way it got when he knew he'd dropped the ball. "I didn't know if it was legit." "Derek, this woman has compiled 17 loan agreements and she's working with an attorney. This is not a scam. This is people trying to hold Gerald Tate accountable for something he's been doing systematically for years. I didn't want to make it worse. If Gerald finds out I'm talking to other borrowers, he might what? Sue you? He can't sue you successfully on a loan agreement that violates state lending regulations. That's the entire point." Silence. "You need to respond to Rosalind," I said. "Tonight. And you need to forward her your documents." A long pause. I could hear Derek processing it. The slow, reluctant machinery of a person who had spent his whole life avoiding paper trails and formal processes now being asked to engage with both simultaneously. "What if I just pay him something?" he said. "Like a partial payment, show good faith, get him to back off?" I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Derek, if you make a partial payment on this loan, you are legally acknowledging the debt as valid. You are potentially resetting the repayment timeline. And you are handing Gerald Tate evidence that you consider the full amount to be legitimately owed. Priya told me this. The attorney in Rosalind's group would tell you the same thing. Please do not pay him anything before you talk to a lawyer." Another silence. Longer this time. "You really think this is winnable?" "I think Gerald Tate has been doing this to vulnerable people for 3 years and nobody has stopped him yet because each person felt too isolated and too ashamed to fight back. And I think you now have access to 17 other people with the same paperwork and a consumer protection attorney who is already building the case. But my name would be on it. Yes. People would know I took a loan like this." And there was the real hesitation. Not fear of Gerald Tate, not fear of legal complexity. Fear of being seen as someone who had needed to borrow $40,000 from an unlicensed lender because his finances had collapsed so completely that legitimate options weren't available to him. Derek's deepest operating fear had always been the same one, looking like he hadn't figured it out. The charm, the ease, the smooth explanations, all of it was armor over that one vulnerable place. The terror of being seen clearly and found lacking. I understood it because I'd watched it my whole life. I just didn't have patience for it anymore. "Derek," I said, "you called me because you were out of options. The option in front of you right now involves documentation, a legitimate attorney, and 17 other people in the same position. The alternative is paying $61,000 you probably don't legally owe to a man who preys on people in financial trouble. Which one of those concerns you more? What people think or what Gerald Tate takes from you?" The silence after that question lasted almost a full minute. Then quietly, "Okay, you'll contact Rosalind?" "Yeah. Tonight." "Good. Send her everything. The original loan documents, every communication you've had with Gerald, every payment you've already made, every voicemail, every text. All of it." "I already made 2 payments," he said. "Early on when I thought I could manage it. About $4,000 total. Forward her the receipts for those 2. That's actually useful. It establishes that you engaged with the repayment in good faith and it helps document the timeline." I heard him exhale. Not the frustrated exhale from earlier in the conversation. Something different. The exhale of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and just felt the weight shift slightly. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. It was a genuine question. Not manipulative, not strategic. Just honest bewilderment from a man who had been genuinely prepared for me to hang up on him. I thought about how to answer it. The true answer was complicated. I was helping him because Rosalind's group had changed the shape of the problem. It was no longer Derek asking me to clean up his personal mess. It was now something larger, a pattern of harm being done to multiple people, and I had skills and information that were genuinely useful. That changed things for me. I was also helping him because I had spent 4 years becoming someone who made decisions based on values rather than wounds. And my value system said that a person being exploited by a predatory lender deserved help regardless of whether that person had once handed me a cardboard box. But I didn't say all of that. I just said because it's the right thing to do. And because Grandma would have done it. Our grandmother, Dorothy, our mother's mother, gone 6 years now, had been the only adult in our family who treated fairness as non-negotiable. She'd had no patience for excuses and no patience for cruelty. She would have helped Derek without hesitation. She also would have looked him in the eye and told him he owed me a real apology, not the half measures he'd been offering, and she would not have moved on until she got one. Derek was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "He would have. He contacted Rosalind that night. I know because she emailed me the next morning. She'd found my contact information through Derek, who had apparently described me as his sister who works in finance and figured out the licensing issue. Rosalind's email was precise and warm in equal measure. The tone of someone who had spent over a year carefully building something and knew exactly what she needed next. She thanked me for identifying the licensing violation. She said their attorney, a woman named Catherine Marsh who specialized in consumer financial protection, had been aware of the unlicensed status but hadn't been able to confirm it was common knowledge among borrowers. The fact that it was now clearly documented and could be demonstrated even to borrowers who hadn't known to look for it strengthened the coalition's position significantly. She also said something that I've thought about many times since. Most people in Gerald Tate's position survive because the people he harms feel too embarrassed or too alone to come forward. The moment you have numbers and documentation and someone who can articulate the legal violation clearly, the power structure inverts. He needs silence to operate. Our job is to make silence impossible. I forwarded her email to Priya, who read it and called me within 10 minutes. "This Catherine Marsh," Priya said. "I know her work. She handled a predatory lending case in the Northern District 2 years ago. He's good. Your brother needs to get formally signed onto the coalition as a named complainant. He's resistant to having his name on things. He's going to be a lot more resistant to paying $61,000. He had a point. I called Derek. I explained what signing onto the coalition meant. His name would appear on the formal complaint to the State Financial Crimes Unit. He would potentially be deposed if the case moved to litigation. His loan agreement would become part of the evidentiary record. That feels very public, he said. Derek, Gerald Tate has your contact information, your address, and a document you signed. He is already preparing to sue you publicly. The question isn't whether this becomes public. The question is whether you're in the coalition or standing alone when it does. Pause. What are the other people like? The ones in the group. I looked back at Rosalind's email. The member list she'd shared with me was still on my screen. A nurse who needed to cover rent. A single dad who needed to fix his car to keep his job. A woman who was trying to avoid eviction after a medical bill. People who needed help and didn't have good options. Derek was quiet for a long time. "That's me," he said finally. "That's exactly what I was. I know. I didn't think I'd be someone who ended up in a situation like this." I thought about the easy smile, the effortless charm, the years of assuming that personality was a substitute for planning. I thought about a cardboard box in 72 hours. I thought about 4 years of building my own floor. I didn't say any of that. I just said nobody does. That's how he finds them. "Hey," Derek said. "I'll sign onto the coalition." "Good." And he paused. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Then I'm sorry, Adrian. For the apartment. For the box. For not calling. For all of it. I know that's late. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know I know what I did." I sat with it for a moment. Not because I was deciding whether to accept it, but because I wanted to actually feel it rather than just process it and move on. He'd said my name. He'd been specific. He hadn't buried the apology inside an ask. "Thank you," I said. "That matters. I mean it. I know you do. Is this..." He started again. "I don't expect everything to be fine. I just want to know if there's a door." I looked out my apartment window. The street below was quiet. Late evening light on the pavement. A woman walking a dog. Ordinary, unhurried life. "There's a door," I said. "But we're going to walk through it slowly." His voice was steadier now. "I can do slow." We stayed on the phone for another few minutes, going through the practical next steps. He would send a formal written confirmation to Rosalind. Catherine Marsh's office would contact him within 48 hours to begin the onboarding process. He was not to communicate with Gerald Tate in any form until he'd spoken with Catherine. Before we hung up, Derek said one more thing. "How did you know about the licensing issue? How did you even know to look for that?" I smiled at the window. "As I read carefully," I said. "Always have." He laughed. A short, quiet sound. "Something real in it." "Yeah," he said. "You always have." 3 weeks after Derek signed onto the coalition, Catherine Marsh called me directly. She introduced herself the way attorneys do when they want you to understand they've already done their homework. Efficiently, no small talk, straight to the point. She'd reviewed Derek's documents alongside the other 17 complaints. She'd confirmed the licensing violation through the state registry. She'd cross-referenced Gerald Tate's notary stamp across all the agreements and found the same irregularity in 11 of them. The same stamp, the same signature, dates that didn't align with the notary's actual commission period. In other words, 11 of those loan agreements had been notarized fraudulently. Derek's was one of them. "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means those 11 agreements are legally void," Catherine said. "An improperly notarized contract is an unenforceable contract. Gerald Tate cannot pursue collection on any of them through legitimate legal channels. If he files suit, he walks into court with fraudulent documentation. That's not a losing case for your brother. That's a case that gets dismissed and potentially referred for criminal investigation." So Derek owes him nothing? Derek owes him nothing on the current claimed amount. There's an argument to be made that the original principal, the $40,000, represented a real transaction and some repayment obligation exists. But the interest calculation is unenforceable, the notarization is fraudulent, and the lender is unlicensed. Any competent judge looks at this and the case collapses before it reaches opening arguments. I exhaled slowly. "When are you filing?" "The coalition complaint goes to the State Financial Crimes Unit on Friday. Simultaneously, we're filing a civil suit on behalf of the borrowers for recovery of payments already made under fraudulent terms. Your brother made 2 payments totaling $4,000. He's entitled to recover that. He'll actually get that money back. If the civil suit succeeds, yes. All 17 borrowers would be entitled to recover payments made. Gerald Tate has assets, a property in his name, 2 business accounts. There's something to recover from. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about Rosalind, whoever she was, sitting somewhere in the same city, having spent over a year carefully collecting names and documents and building something solid enough to matter. I thought about Denise, who'd needed $15,000 to cover rent and ended up being told she owed $34,000. I thought about the single father and the nurse and all the others whose names I didn't know but whose paperwork now sat in a 43-page complaint on its way to the State Financial Crimes Unit. And I thought about Gerald Tate, who had operated for 3 years in the comfortable certainty that the people he targeted were too isolated, too ashamed, and too financially precarious to fight back. He was about to find out what happens when they do. I called Derek. Catherine filed on Friday, I said. The criminal complaint and the civil suit both. Pause. So it's real. It's real. What happens now? Now Gerald Tate finds out he's been named in a state financial crimes complaint alongside 17 documented victims and a fraudulent notarization pattern. His attorney, assuming he has one, will advise him to settle. And if he doesn't settle, then it goes to court and he loses in a way that becomes public record. Derek was quiet for a moment. Do you think he'll try to contact me? Before the settlement? Possibly. Catherine said he may attempt direct contact with individual borrowers to try to negotiate private agreements before the case moves forward. If he calls you, texts you, shows up anywhere, you don't respond. You forward everything to Catherine's office immediately. Derek. I paused. I mean it. Not a word to him. Not a "I'll call you back," not a "let me think about it." Nothing. I got it. I promise. Gerald Tate called Derek 4 days later. Derek forwarded me the voicemail without responding to it, exactly as I'd told him to. I listened to it once. The voice was smooth. Reasonable sounding. The kind of voice that had probably convinced 17 people to sign documents they didn't read carefully enough. He said he'd heard Derek had been speaking to some people about the loan. He said he understood that financial stress made people do things they later regretted. He said he was prepared to offer Derek a significantly reduced settlement. He used the word settlement as though he were the wronged party. If Derek was willing to sign a confidentiality agreement and withdraw from any group complaints within the next 5 business days. He didn't mention the fraudulent notarization. He didn't mention the licensing violation. He offered Derek a number that was still $22,000 more than the original principal. And he wrapped the whole thing in the language of reasonableness and mutual benefit and moving forward. I forwarded the voicemail to Catherine's office with one line. He made contact. Offering private settlement with confidentiality clause. Catherine's response came back in 11 minutes. Perfect. This is exactly what we needed. Do not respond. This call will be included in the filing. The man had called Derek to make the problem go away quietly and had instead handed Catherine Marsh a recorded example of witness tampering to add to her complaint. I did not tell Derek that last part immediately. I didn't want him to feel the pressure of understanding that Gerald Tate was now actively trying to isolate him from the coalition. I just told him Catherine had the voicemail, he'd done exactly the right thing, and to sit tight. What I didn't anticipate was that Gerald Tate wouldn't stop at one call. Over the next 10 days he called Derek 3 more times. Derek forwarded every voicemail without responding to any of them. The tone changed as the calls progressed. The first had been smooth and reasonable. The second was still controlled but had a harder edge. More emphasis on the confidentiality clause, more urgency about the 5-day window. The third dropped the pleasantries almost entirely. He mentioned that he had documentation of Derek's payments and intended to pursue the full claimed amount in court if Derek didn't respond. The fourth call was different. The fourth call came on a Thursday morning. Derek was at work. He stepped outside to listen to it and called me immediately after. He mentioned you, Derek said. His voice was strange. Flat in the way voices go when someone is working to stay calm. He said he knew Derek had a sister who'd been helping him and that involving outside parties in a private financial matter could create complications for her professionally. I felt something cold move through me. Then I felt it settle. He researched you, Derek said. He knows where you work. Forward me the voicemail. Trin. Derek. Forward me the voicemail and then call Catherine's office. Right now. Before you do anything else. He forwarded it. I listened. Gerald Tate's voice on that recording was still controlled, still reasonable sounding on the surface. But underneath it was something that hadn't been in the earlier calls. Something that understood the walls were closing and was reaching for whatever leverage remained. He knew my name. He knew my employer. He suggested, in the careful language of someone who understood exactly how close to a line he was walking, that a person in a financial advisory role who had been providing counsel in an unlicensed capacity might face professional questions if the matter became more complicated. It was a threat dressed in plausible deniability. I called Catherine directly. She listened to the voicemail twice. When she spoke again, her voice was the same efficient calm it always was, but with something additional underneath it. Something that sounded like satisfaction. He just threatened a witness, she said. And implicitly threatened you for assisting in a consumer protection matter, which is a protected activity under state law. This recording goes to the Financial Crimes Unit today as a supplemental filing. I'm also copying the State Bar because he's been communicating directly with represented parties through his attorney. He has an attorney? He retained one 3 days ago. Which means his attorney has advised him not to contact the borrowers directly. He called anyway. Pause. Gerald Tate is scared. Scared people make mistakes. He just made a significant one. The formal hearing before the State Financial Crimes Unit was scheduled for a date 6 weeks out. Gerald Tate didn't make it to the hearing. His attorney contacted Catherine's office 9 days before the scheduled date and indicated that his client wished to explore a global settlement with all named complainants. The negotiation took 4 days. I wasn't in the room, I wasn't a party to the civil suit, but Catherine kept Derek updated and Derek kept me updated in real time, a chain of texts arriving at irregular hours as the numbers shifted. The final settlement terms were not made public, which is standard in civil cases of this type. But Derek told me what his individual portion looked like. The $4,000 in payments he'd already made was returned in full. The outstanding claimed balance of $61,000 was formally discharged, meaning legally, on paper with documentation, Derek owed Gerald Tate nothing. 0. The loan was gone. As part of the settlement, Gerald Tate agreed to cease all lending activity in the state, surrender his business accounts to a court-supervised audit, and cooperate with the ongoing financial crimes investigation. His attorney negotiated those terms in exchange for the civil plaintiffs agreeing not to pursue additional damages beyond the direct recovery amounts. The criminal investigation, Catherine told Derek carefully, was separate. The settlement affected the civil matter. What the State Financial Crimes Unit chose to do with the fraud referral was entirely outside anyone's negotiation. Derek called me the night the settlement was signed. He didn't say much at first. This is done. I know, I said. Catherine texted me. I keep waiting to feel relieved and instead I just feel, I don't know, tired. That's what relief feels like when you've been carrying something for a long time. Pause. Outside my window the city was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, ongoing. I've been thinking, Derek said. About what you said. About walking through the door slowly. Yeah. I want to do that. I want to actually do that. Not just say it. I don't know what it looks like. Neither do I said honestly. But I think it starts with showing up consistently over time without an agenda. No asks. No emergencies. Just being a person in each other's lives. I can do that. We'll see, I said. Not unkindly. Just truthfully. He laughed softly. Fair. We stayed on the phone a little longer, talking about nothing in particular. He asked about my work. I told him about a project I was finishing. He mentioned he'd started looking at a certification program, something in project management, a real credential with a real pathway. He said it carefully, the way someone says something they're not sure they believe in yet but want to try believing in. I told him that sounded like a good idea. And for the first time in a very long conversation that had started 4 years late, I meant it without qualification. 4 months after the settlement was signed, Gerald Tate was indicted. I found out the same way most people find out about things they've been quietly waiting for. Not with fanfare, not with a phone call from someone important, but through a Google alert I'd set up on his name sometime during the third week of the coalition process, when I realized I was checking the news manually every morning anyway and I might as well automate it. The notification arrived on a Tuesday. Early. I was still in my kitchen, first cup of coffee, still in the clothes I slept in. The headline was brief. Local lender faces federal fraud charges in predatory loan scheme. 8 counts. Wire fraud, fraudulent notarization, unlicensed financial services activity, and 3 counts related to the witness contact recordings. The calls he'd made to Derek, including the one where he'd mentioned my name and my employer. That last part mattered to me more than I expected it to. Not because I'd been frightened by his threat. I hadn't been, not really. But because there is something specifically satisfying about watching a person who believed they could silence you with a veiled professional threat discover that the recording of that threat became one of 8 counts in a federal indictment. He'd reached for leverage and handed prosecutors a gift. I texted Derek a link to the article with no message. Just the link. His response came back in 2 minutes. A single line. Grandma Dorothy would have loved this. I laughed out loud in my empty kitchen. He wasn't wrong. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I think when you spend a long time bracing for something, a confrontation, a reckoning, a resolution, you build up an unconscious expectation that when it finally arrives it will feel proportional to the weight you've been carrying. That there will be some ceremony to it. Some clear before and after. There wasn't. Life just continued. Differently but quietly. Derek enrolled in the project management certification program he'd mentioned on the phone. He texted me a photo of his course materials the first week. A thick workbook, a highlighter, a coffee cup. A very ordinary photo of a person starting something. I saved it without responding immediately, then wrote back an hour later. How's the reading? Boring, he said. But I'm doing it. That's how most important things feel at the start. Is that a motivational poster? It's just true. We had our first in-person meeting 6 weeks after the indictment. Not a dinner, not an occasion. Just coffee. A place near his apartment, neutral, public, no history attached to it. I got there first, ordered, sat by the window. When he walked in I saw him scan the room before he spotted me. And for a half-second before he arranged his face into something composed, I saw the uncertainty in him. The not knowing how this would go. I understood it because I felt it too. We sat across from each other with our coffee cups and the particular awkwardness of 2 people who share 26 years of history and are trying to figure out how much of it to bring into the room. He looked older. Not in a bad way. Just more worn in. Like a piece of furniture that had been through some weather and settled into its actual shape. I probably looked the same to him. We talked for 2 hours. Slowly at first surfaced things. His certification program. My work. The neighborhood he'd moved to. We avoided the center of everything and circled it, and then, somewhere in the second hour, Derek set down his cup and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When I called you that night, when I first called, did you think about not helping? Did you consider just not picking up?" I thought about it honestly before answering. "I thought about it," I said. "But the reason I helped wasn't really about you. Not at first. It was about what Gerald Tate was doing. Once I understood the pattern, once I saw Rosalind's group and the documentation, it became something larger than the 2 of us. And I couldn't walk away from something larger than the 2 of us just because you and I had history. But you stayed," he said. "Even after he threatened you." "Because threatening me was a mistake," I said. Told me he was scared. And scared people in the wrong are easier to beat than confident ones. Derek smiled at that. A real smile, not the performance smile. "You've always been like that. Even when we were kids. You'd get very calm when something was unfair. I used to think it was weird. It's called controlled anger. It's effective. I know." He wrapped his hands around his cup. Outside the window a delivery truck was double parked, hazard lights blinking. An ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary city. I've been thinking about the apartment, he said. About why I did it the way I did. I waited. I think, and I'm not saying this as an excuse, I'm saying it as an explanation. I think I told myself you'd be fine because I needed you to be fine. I needed the story where you landed on your feet immediately and it cost you nothing so that I didn't have to sit with what I'd actually done. He paused. Cost you something. I know that. You had to rebuild from nothing because of a choice I made for my own convenience. The delivery truck outside moved on. A woman walked past with a stroller. It did cost me something, I said. But I also want to be honest with you. What I built after the apartment, I built it because you were gone. The version of me that exists right now, the version who knew how to read your loan documents and identify the licensing violation and hold the line when Gerald Tate made threats. That person got built in the 4 years you weren't around. I'm not saying I'm grateful for the box. I'm saying I can hold both things. What you did was wrong and what I built because of it was real. Derek was quiet for a long moment. I don't deserve that framing, he said. Oh, I agreed. But I'm keeping it for myself, not for you. He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means someone is filing something away carefully, treating it with the weight it deserves. We didn't resolve everything at that coffee table. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story that wants a neater ending. The dramatic confrontation, the tearful reconciliation, the complete restoration of something that was broken. That's not what happened. What happened was two people sitting across from each other and agreeing without saying it in so many words, to try. That was enough. That was actually quite a lot. Our mother called me the week after the indictment news broke. She'd seen it somehow. A mutual connection, a shared Facebook post, the particular speed with which information travels in family networks even when the family has been largely silent for years. I heard about Derek, she said. About the loan and everything. Are you okay? I told her I was fine. He told me you helped him, she said. That you figured out what was wrong with the paperwork. I did. Pause. My mother had a specific kind of pause that contained whole paragraphs of things she was choosing not to say. I'd grown up learning to read those pauses. I should have called more, she said finally. After you moved out of the apartment. After everything with Derek. I should have called and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. This was my mother's version of a reckoning. Not dramatic, not demonstrative. Just a quiet acknowledgement delivered 4 years late in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I know, Mom, I said. I know you should have. Are you two? Is it okay now? Between you and Derek? We're working on it. Good. And I could hear the relief in her voice. The genuine relief of a mother who had watched her children estranged and hadn't known how to fix it and was now being told it might be getting better. He's a good person underneath all of it. I know he is, I said. That's why it hurt. She didn't have an answer for that. But she stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes and we talked about ordinary things, and it was the longest conversation we'd had in years. Rosalind turned out to live 12 minutes from my apartment. I found this out because she emailed me 3 months after the settlement to thank me formally for the licensing research, which Catherine had credited in her filing. We exchanged a few emails and eventually, on a Friday evening, met for a glass of wine at a bar equidistant between our two neighborhoods. She was in her late 30s, a former office manager who'd been laid off during a company restructuring, taken the loan from Gerald Tate to cover her family's expenses during the gap, and spent 14 months building the coalition because, as she put it, I had time and I was furious and I'm good at spreadsheets. She was also, I discovered over 2 hours of conversation, one of the sharpest people I'd met in a long time. Most people, she said, when something like this happens to them, spend their energy being ashamed. The shame is by design. He counted on it. Every one of us sat alone with our documents for months before we found each other. Why did you start the group? I asked. Because I kept thinking about the next person. She turned her wine glass slowly on the table. I couldn't undo what happened to me. But I could make it harder for him to do it to someone else. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone that first night. I'm in some trouble. The specific sound of a person who had been sitting alone with something for too long. Do you know how many people he contacted who never joined the group? I asked. Who just paid quietly or disappeared? Rosalind nodded. Catherine estimates the actual number of victims is between 40 and 60. We have 18 documented. The rest, she paused, they're out there somewhere. Most of them probably still think it was their fault. We sat with that for a moment. Outside the bar, the city moved past the window. Cars, pedestrians, ordinary Friday evening life. For what it's worth, I said, you changed the outcome for my brother. He would have kept trying to handle it alone. He would have made a partial payment and it would have bought him 3 more months of pressure and then he'd have been worse off. That's what he does, Rosalind said. Not about Derek specifically, but about Gerald Tate. He creates just enough pressure that people act before they think. The 5-day windows, the midnight calls, the reasonable voice. It's all designed to keep you moving too fast to stop and read. And stopping and reading is the entire defense. She raised her glass. Entirely. Derek passed his first project management certification exam on a Thursday in November. He texted me from the parking lot of the testing center before he'd even gotten back to his car. 1 word and a photograph. The photograph was of the pass notification on the exam screen. The word was Adrian. Just my name. In capitals. Like an announcement. I sat at my desk at work and looked at it for a long moment. Then I typed back, I knew you would. It wasn't entirely true. I hadn't known. I'd hoped, cautiously, the way you hope for things you can't control. But it felt like the right thing to say. And honestly, by that point it felt like something true in the process of becoming truer. He called that evening. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me about the exam, about the parts he'd been nervous about a study group he'd joined that had turned into something he actually looked forward to. He talked about the certification the way someone talks about a thing that surprised them by mattering. Before we hung up he said, I've been thinking about something. What? You said a few months ago that the door was there but we'd walk through it slowly. I've been trying to figure out what walking through it actually looks like. And I think he paused. I think it looks like this. Like calling on a Thursday because something good happened and you're the person I wanted to tell. I looked out my apartment window. The same window I'd looked out on 100 ordinary evenings. The city doing its ordinary city things. Yeah, I said. I think that's exactly what it looks like. We didn't need to say anything else after that. Some doors, when they've been closed long enough, don't swing open dramatically. They just ease open slowly in small increments on unremarkable Thursday evenings. And sometimes that's better. Sometimes the quiet way through is the only way that lasts. I want to stop here for a second before I let you go. Because I've been telling you a story about my brother and a predatory lender and a coalition of people who decided that silence wasn't going to work for them anymore. And all of that is true. Every detail happened. But underneath all of it, the story I was really telling you was simpler than any of that. It was about what happens when someone who hurt you comes back. Not with a clean apology tied in a bow. Not with a transformation complete and verified. Needing something. Standing at the edge of the damage they caused and holding out their hand. And you have to decide what you do with that. I want to be honest with you about something I didn't say explicitly in the earlier parts of this story. Helping Derek was not easy. Not emotionally. There were moments in the middle of all of it, when I'd get off a call with Catherine or forward another document to Priya and then sit alone in my apartment and feel the full weight of the irony. That I was spending my evenings and my expertise and my energy protecting a person who had handed me a cardboard box and not called for 4 years. There were moments when it felt like too much to ask of myself. What kept me going wasn't forgiveness. I want to be clear about that because I think we tell ourselves a story about these situations that isn't always honest. The story goes, you forgive and then you help and then everything gets better. That's a clean narrative. It's also not how it worked for me. What kept me going was something more practical. It was the recognition that Gerald Tate was doing something wrong to multiple people and I had skills that were specifically useful for stopping it. My helping Derek was embedded inside something larger than Derek. And that made it possible to show up fully even when the personal history was complicated. The forgiveness came later. Quietly without announcement. Not as a decision I made but as a thing I noticed had happened. Like realizing one morning that a bruise you'd been careful around for years had finally faded. I tell you that because I think we put too much pressure on forgiveness as a prerequisite for action. We tell people, you have to forgive first and then you can move forward. But sometimes you move forward first through the work, through the showing up, through the choosing to act anyway, and forgiveness follows at its own pace without being forced. That was my experience. Yours may be different. But I wanted to name it honestly. Now I want to ask you something. And I mean this genuinely, not as a script, not as a content strategy, but because the people who find these stories are usually finding them for a reason. Have you ever been the one who got handed the box? The one who was removed from something? A home, a family, a relationship, a shared life. Not because of anything you did but because someone else decided you were inconvenient? And then had to rebuild from scratch while the person who removed you carried on like nothing significant had happened? If that's you, I want you to know something. What you built in the aftermath is yours. Completely, irrevocably yours. Nobody who handed you a box and walked away gets credit for the floor you built to stand on. Not their patience, not their influence, not their proximity. You built it. In the time they weren't there, with resources they didn't provide, through difficulty they didn't witness. That floor belongs to you. And here's the other thing I want you to know. The skills you developed surviving what they did to you. The careful reading, the controlled calm, the ability to see clearly when everyone around you is reacting emotionally. Those skills don't disappear when the person comes back. You don't have to unlearn what you learned just because the relationship is shifting. You get to keep all of it. The growth and the relationship, if you choose to rebuild it, don't have to be in competition. I also want to ask you this. Have you ever been Derek? Have you ever made a choice? Maybe not as dramatic as handing someone a cardboard box, but a choice that prioritized your own comfort or your own fear over someone who trusted you, and then spent years not calling because the call felt too hard and the longer you waited the harder it got? If that's you, I want you to know something too. The call being hard doesn't mean you shouldn't make it. Derek called me on a Tuesday night from a place of genuine desperation. And I won't tell you his motives were pure at the start. They weren't. He needed something. But somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the need transformed into something more honest. Into an actual reckoning with what he'd done. That transformation was possible because he picked up the phone. Whatever call you've been putting off. Whatever conversation you've been rearranging your life to avoid. Whatever person you stopped calling because the silence had gone on so long you didn't know how to break it. It is not too late to break it. It might be hard. The person on the other end might not be ready. You might have to sit with their anger or their distance or their careful measured pace. But the call being hard is not the same as the call being wrong. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Not because it's something I'm supposed to say, but because the reason I tell these stories is that I genuinely believe most people are carrying something they've never said out loud. And sometimes reading someone else's version of a thing gives you permission to finally name your own. Were you the one who got the box? Or the one who handed it? Or, and I think this is more common than either of those, were you both at different points to different people? Tell me. I want to know. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt like something you needed to hear today, share it with someone who needs it more than you do. You probably already know who that person is. There are more stories like this one in the description below. Each one is different. Each one is true. Each one is about people who found themselves at the edge of something they didn't choose and had to decide what to do next. Thank you for staying until the end. I mean that more than it sounds like I mean it. Take care of yourself first. Nobody else has that job but you.